Some mistakes can be explained. Others echo for a lifetime. The flashing red and blue lights painted long streaks across the empty Arizona highway as a black SUV eased onto the shoulder beneath the fading glow of a desert sunset. Cars continued rushing past at 70 miles per hour, their drivers barely glancing toward what looked like another routine traffic stop, another ordinary moment that would disappear into the endless rhythm of the interstate. Officer Ryan Walker stepped out of his patrol vehicle with the confidence of someone who believed he had complete control over the next few minutes. His polished badge reflected the last rays of daylight as his radio crackled softly against the silence surrounding the open road. Inside the SUV, Colonel Maya Brooks rested both hands on the steering wheel exactly where they could be seen. Her breathing remained slow, measured, almost practiced. More than 20 years of military leadership had taught her that composure often spoke louder than words. She had driven thousands of miles across the country, through crowded cities and lonely highways alike, and she understood that patience could prevent misunderstandings before they ever began. The dashboard clock quietly marked the passing seconds. She was expected in Washington, D.C., the following morning for a high-level Army briefing that few people even knew existed. The leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat contained documents protected by layers of security clearance, though nothing about the woman behind the wheel suggested extraordinary authority. She wore a simple navy jacket over civilian clothing, no medals, no decorations, no visible symbols of rank. To anyone passing by, she appeared to be nothing more than another traveler finishing a long drive. Ryan approached with deliberate steps, studying every movement through narrowed eyes. Before Maya could speak, another cruiser slowed in the distance, its headlights cutting through the growing twilight before continuing down the highway. The desert wind carried tiny clouds of dust across the asphalt, while the steady hum of distant traffic filled the quiet spaces between each heartbeat. Somewhere far above, an airliner traced a white line across the evening sky, completely unaware that lives below were about to change forever. Maya slowly lowered her driver's side window. "Good evening, officer," she said calmly, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to responsibility rather than confrontation. Ryan offered only a brief nod before requesting her license and registration. She acknowledged the request with measured courtesy and explained that she intended to reach for the documents exactly as instructed. Every movement remained careful, deliberate, transparent. Yet something in the atmosphere had already shifted. It was almost impossible to describe, like the subtle pressure in the air before a summer storm finally breaks. Imagine sitting inside that vehicle, doing everything you believe is right, while sensing that the person standing outside has already decided who you are before hearing your first sentence. Neither passing motorists nor the hidden dashboard camera could know that within minutes this quiet roadside encounter would be replayed across television screens, debated inside military offices, examined by investigators, and remembered as the day an entire department discovered they had stopped the wrong woman. 45 minutes earlier, the highway had felt almost peaceful. The Arizona desert stretched endlessly beneath a sky brushed with gold and crimson, while the distant mountains faded into soft blue silhouettes against the horizon. Colonel Maya Brooks preferred drives like this because they offered something rare after decades of military service: silence. The steady rhythm of the tires rolling across smooth pavement gave her a chance to think without interruption. Her destination was still hundreds of miles away, yet every mile had already been planned with military precision. A secure briefing awaited her in Washington, District of Columbia, the following morning, bringing together senior officers responsible for decisions that would shape thousands of lives. Very few people outside the Department of Defense even knew the meeting existed. Maya glanced briefly toward the leather portfolio resting beside her. Inside were identification documents, encrypted communications, and carefully organized notes prepared over several months. None of them mattered more to her than the small framed photograph tucked inside the folder. It showed her standing beside her late father in front of the modest brick home where she had grown up in Savannah, Georgia. He had spent 30 years wearing a city maintenance uniform, often reminding his daughter that true authority was never measured by rank alone. Respect, he always said, was earned when no one was watching. Those words had followed Maya through every promotion, every deployment, and every difficult decision she had ever faced. She had become one of the youngest colonels in her command, not because she demanded attention, but because she listened before speaking and led before asking others to follow. Outside the vehicle, the evening breeze carried the scent of dry earth and desert sage across the highway. Traffic remained light, mostly long-haul truck drivers and families returning from summer vacations. Everything about the drive felt ordinary. Maya reached for the radio and allowed a quiet jazz station to fill the cabin with soft piano music. It reminded her of evenings at home, where she rarely discussed classified missions or military responsibilities. Friends knew her simply as Maya, the neighbor who volunteered at veterans events, coached high school leadership programs, and never missed her niece's birthday. Title stayed at work. Character traveled everywhere. Several miles ahead, another patrol vehicle sat hidden near an overpass, almost invisible until its emergency lights suddenly burst into life. Maya noticed them in her rearview mirror and calmly checked her speed. She was well within the posted limit. Her vehicle registration was current. Every inspection sticker was valid. She signaled, gradually reduced speed, and guided the sport utility vehicle onto the shoulder exactly as every defensive driving course recommended. Before turning off the engine, she quietly repeated the same advice she had once given dozens of young soldiers during training exercises. Stay calm. Move carefully. Communicate clearly. Assumptions disappear when professionalism remains. She had no reason to believe this stop would become anything more than a brief conversation before continuing her journey. Yet sometimes history changes without warning. Not because of complicated plans or dramatic speeches, but because two complete strangers meet for the first time carrying entirely different expectations about the person standing before them. Ryan Walker stopped just short of the driver's window and studied the woman inside with an expression that revealed more suspicion than curiosity. Maya Brooks met his eyes only briefly before returning her attention to the steering wheel, keeping both hands exactly where they could be seen. The desert wind brushed against the side of the vehicle, carrying tiny grains of sand across the pavement, while the emergency lights reflected in repeating waves against the black paint of the sport utility vehicle. Everything Maya did followed the same disciplined routine she had practiced for years. She waited for instructions instead of making assumptions. She answered questions with steady confidence instead of frustration. She understood that calmness often prevented ordinary situations from becoming complicated ones. Ryan requested her driver's license once again, this time with a sharper tone that caused the silence between them to grow heavier. Maya acknowledged him respectfully and explained that her identification was inside a leather wallet resting in the center console. Before moving, she clearly described what she intended to do, then slowly reached toward the compartment exactly as instructed. The movement lasted only a few seconds, yet Ryan watched every inch of it with unusual intensity. His shoulders stiffened. His breathing became shorter. The conversation no longer sounded like a routine traffic stop. It sounded like two people speaking completely different languages despite using the same words. Maya handed him her license and registration without hesitation. Ryan examined the documents longer than necessary before looking back toward her face. He asked where she was traveling, why she was driving alone, and whether anyone else had access to the vehicle. Maya answered each question honestly. She explained that she was traveling east for official business and preferred driving whenever her schedule allowed because it gave her time to think. She did not mention her military rank. She did not mention classified meetings. She did not mention security clearances. Those details were never offered unless absolutely required. Outside the vehicle, another motorist slowed slightly while passing, noticing the flashing lights before continuing down the interstate. Somewhere behind Ryan, his body camera quietly recorded every word, every pause, every glance. Neither of them seemed aware that those ordinary moments would soon be examined frame by people far beyond the local department. Ryan circled the vehicle slowly, studying every window before stopping beside the passenger door. Through the glass, he noticed the leather portfolio resting on the seat. His attention lingered on it for several seconds. From where Maya sat, she could see the subtle change in his expression. It was the same look she had witnessed countless times throughout her career whenever someone decided that unanswered questions were more important than observable facts. Imagine recognizing that look before a single accusation has even been spoken aloud. Imagine understanding that no amount of patience may be enough once another person's assumptions begin filling the empty spaces where evidence should be. Maya remained exactly where she was, breathing slowly, reminding herself that professionalism was not tested during easy conversations. It was tested during difficult ones. She believed that respect could still guide the next few minutes back toward common understanding. She had no way of knowing that the next decision either of them made would permanently alter the course of both their lives. Ryan Walker returned to the driver's window with slower, heavier steps than before. His eyes never left the leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat, and the questions that followed no longer sounded routine. They sounded personal. "What is inside the case?" he asked. Maya answered with the same composed tone she had maintained from the beginning. She explained that it contained work materials and personal documents that she was responsible for transporting. Ryan immediately asked her to hand it over. Maya politely replied that she would gladly comply once he explained the legal reason for searching her belongings. There was no anger in her voice, no challenge, only a calm request for clarification. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire highway. The evening breeze continued carrying dust across the shoulder, while the emergency lights painted endless flashes of red and blue against the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a freight truck sounded its air horn before disappearing beyond the horizon. Ryan's expression hardened. He repeated the instruction, this time louder. Maya nodded respectfully and explained once again that she intended to cooperate fully, but she wanted to understand the basis for the request. She had spent more than 2 decades teaching young officers and soldiers that professionalism depended upon communication, not assumptions. She believed the same principle applied here. Unfortunately, Ryan appeared to hear hesitation where none existed. His breathing became noticeably faster. His radio crackled with a brief transmission from dispatch, but he ignored it. Every passing second seemed to reinforce an opinion that had already formed in his mind long before any evidence existed. Imagine standing in complete compliance while realizing that your calmness is somehow making another person even more suspicious. Imagine choosing respectful words, careful movements, and measured breathing, only to discover that none of them are changing the direction of the conversation. Maya remained exactly as she was, her hands visible, her posture relaxed, her attention fixed on the officer speaking to her. She quietly informed him before reaching toward her seatbelt, asking whether he wanted her to step outside the vehicle. Ryan immediately instructed her to remain still. She stopped moving without hesitation. Another long pause settled between them. Passing drivers slowed slightly, drawn by the flashing patrol lights before continuing down the interstate. A woman traveling with her family glanced through the passenger window of a nearby sport utility vehicle, sensing tension without understanding its cause. Ryan took one step backward and placed a hand near his shoulder microphone. His voice became firm as he requested additional units to respond as a precaution. The dispatcher acknowledged the call, and the radio fell silent again. Maya heard every word. Even then, she refused to let anxiety replace discipline. She had faced combat zones overseas, humanitarian missions after hurricanes, and impossible leadership decisions that affected thousands of service members. None of those experiences had taught her to panic. They had taught her to remain steady when others could not. She looked through the windshield as the first stars began appearing above the desert sky, and quietly reminded herself that truth did not become weaker simply because someone failed to recognize it. Yet in that quiet moment, as another set of flashing lights appeared far behind Ryan on the darkening highway, she felt something she had not experienced in years. It was not fear. It was the unmistakable realization that this ordinary evening was moving beyond anyone's ability to quietly resolve it. The additional patrol units arrived one by one, their emergency lights washing the desert shoulder in alternating bands of red, blue, and white. The quiet highway that had seemed almost empty only minutes earlier now carried the unmistakable tension of an unfolding incident. Officers exchanged brief words over their radios while maintaining careful distance around the parked sport utility vehicle. Passing drivers slowed as they approached, some looking through their windshields with curiosity before continuing into the darkness. Maya Brooks remained exactly where she had been instructed, her seat belt still fastened, her hands resting in plain view. She had learned long ago that composure was not simply a habit. It was a decision repeated one breath at a time. Ryan Walker stood several feet away, speaking with another responding officer in low voices. Although Maya could not hear every word, she noticed the frequent glances directed toward the leather portfolio on the passenger seat. It had become the center of attention despite never having been opened. The assumptions surrounding it seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. Finally, one of the responding officers approached the driver's window with a noticeably calmer demeanor. He introduced himself, thanked Maya for remaining cooperative, and asked whether she would be willing to step outside so everyone could continue the conversation more comfortably. Maya nodded respectfully. Before moving, she carefully explained each action she intended to take, exactly as she had done from the beginning. She slowly unfastened her seat belt, paused, and waited for acknowledgement before opening the door. The evening air felt cooler now, carrying the scent of dry desert brush across the shoulder. Standing beside the vehicle, Maya appeared remarkably composed despite the growing circle of patrol cars surrounding her. Her posture reflected decades of military discipline rather than confrontation. She answered every question directly, never raising her voice, never allowing frustration to replace courtesy. Imagine finding yourself surrounded by flashing lights, unfamiliar faces, and growing suspicion while realizing that the simplest truth about your identity could end the misunderstanding immediately. Yet years of service had also taught Maya another lesson. Sensitive information was never revealed casually, especially before confirming that proper procedures had been followed. Respect for security protocols had become second nature. Ryan interpreted her restraint very differently. Each careful answer seemed to reinforce his certainty that something important was being concealed. He requested permission to inspect the portfolio once more. Maya calmly explained that she would cooperate with every lawful instruction and simply asked that the reason be clearly communicated. Her response remained measured, professional, and free of emotion. Then something unexpected happened. As a light breeze swept across the shoulder, the portfolio shifted slightly on the passenger seat. The latch, which had never been fully secured after her last fuel stop, quietly released. A slim identification holder slid, only a few inches into view without falling from the vehicle. One of the responding officers noticed the edge of a dark green credential and instinctively leaned closer. He did not touch it. He simply looked for a moment before his expression changed completely. The confidence in his posture disappeared, replaced by visible uncertainty. His eyes moved from the credential back to Maya, then toward Ryan, as though trying to reconcile two completely different versions of the same story. For the first time since the traffic stop began, silence spread across everyone standing on that lonely stretch of highway. Sometimes the truth does not announce itself with raised voices or dramatic gestures. Sometimes it appears quietly, waiting for someone willing to see what has been there all along. The officer who had noticed the partially exposed credential did not speak immediately. Instead, he took one careful step backward and looked at Ryan Walker with an expression that had completely lost its earlier certainty. The confidence surrounding the roadside stop dissolved into visible hesitation. Ryan frowned, unable to understand what had changed in only a few seconds. "Is something wrong?" he asked. The responding officer glanced once more toward the identification holder before answering quietly. "I think we need to slow down." His words carried no accusation, only caution. Maya remained exactly where she stood, her hands relaxed at her sides, saying nothing that might interrupt the moment. Years of leadership had taught her that truth often needed no assistance once people became willing to look at it honestly. The officer carefully asked whether he had permission to view the credential. Maya nodded. "Yes, officer. Thank you for asking." He retrieved the identification with deliberate care and opened it just enough to confirm what he was seeing. His eyes widened almost instantly. He looked again, making certain he had not misunderstood. The photograph matched perfectly. The security markings were unmistakable. The official seal left little room for doubt. His posture straightened instinctively before he closed the credential and returned it with both hands. "Colonel Brooks," he said respectfully, almost under his breath. Ryan stared at him in confusion. "Colonel." The word seemed completely out of place beside the lonely highway and the ordinary black sport utility vehicle. Maya accepted the credential with a polite nod. "Yes, officer. I am Colonel Maya Brooks with the United States Army." She spoke without pride or anger, simply stating a fact that she had intentionally withheld until proper procedures allowed it to be shared. Silence settled over the entire scene. Even the steady stream of radio chatter seemed to pause for a brief moment. Several officers exchanged uncertain looks, suddenly realizing that the woman they had viewed through the lens of suspicion had quietly demonstrated professionalism from the very beginning. Imagine discovering that the person you questioned with growing doubt had spent more than 20 years leading soldiers through situations requiring discipline, integrity, and extraordinary responsibility. Imagine realizing that every calm answer, every measured movement, and every respectful request had reflected training far beyond anything visible from the outside. Ryan's expression shifted from certainty to disbelief. He searched Maya's face as though hoping to find some sign that this revelation could not possibly be real. Instead, he found the same calm composure that had never changed from the first moment their conversation began. Before anyone could speak again, another vehicle approached from the opposite direction. It was not a patrol car. It carried federal government plates and slowed as it reached the line of emergency vehicles. Two uniformed military personnel stepped out and walked toward the group with quiet confidence. They had been tracking Colonel Brooks's travel schedule after communication delays raised concern about her arrival. One of them immediately recognized her and offered a respectful greeting. The atmosphere changed instantly. What had begun as an ordinary roadside stop was now understood in an entirely different light. Yet Maya did not celebrate the revelation or seek to embarrass anyone standing before her. She simply looked across the dark highway and said softly, "Respect is strongest when it is given before someone knows your title." No one answered because every person present understood that the lesson had already been delivered. The military vehicle remained parked quietly beside the line of patrol cars while the desert night settled over the highway. The flashing emergency lights that had dominated the scene only minutes earlier suddenly felt smaller, almost insignificant compared to the realization spreading among everyone present. One of the military officers briefly confirmed Colonel Maya Brooks's identity through a secure communication channel, speaking in calm, measured sentences that left no room for uncertainty. Within moments, acknowledgments came back from multiple federal contacts. The confirmation was immediate. Maya had been traveling under official orders, and her expected arrival had already been documented hours before the traffic stop ever began. Ryan Walker stood motionless, his earlier confidence replaced by visible disbelief. The questions that had seemed so certain now echoed differently inside his own mind. Every instruction he had given, every assumption he had made, every conclusion he had reached was suddenly viewed through an entirely different lens. Yet Maya did not raise her voice or demand an apology. She simply waited with the same quiet dignity that had defined every minute of the encounter. Imagine discovering that the person you judged within seconds had spent decades earning the trust of thousands through discipline, sacrifice, and leadership. Imagine realizing that the respect you withheld had never depended upon a title, a uniform, or an identification card. It had depended upon your willingness to see another human being before making up your mind. One of the supervising officers requested that all body camera recordings from every responding deputy be preserved exactly as captured. Dash camera footage from the patrol vehicles was secured as well. No one argued. No one questioned the instruction. Everyone understood that transparency now mattered more than protecting anyone's pride. As the recordings were cataloged, another supervisor quietly reviewed the dispatch log. The timeline revealed something unexpected. From the very first radio transmission, Maya had remained cooperative. Every instruction had been acknowledged. Every movement had been announced before it happened. Every request for clarification had been respectful. The official record told a story very different from the assumptions that had driven the encounter. Additional reviews uncovered something else. Similar complaints involving unnecessary escalation had appeared in Ryan's personnel history over several years. None alone had resulted in major disciplinary action, but together they formed a pattern that investigators could no longer ignore. Previous encounters involving respectful drivers who later questioned the handling of their stops suddenly received renewed attention. Files that had gathered dust inside administrative cabinets were reopened. Supervisors who had once considered each incident isolated began recognizing uncomfortable similarities. Maya listened quietly as the discussions unfolded around her, but she refused every attempt to turn the evening into a personal victory. When one military officer remarked that the misunderstanding would likely end several careers, Maya answered with gentle honesty. Justice is not about destroying people. It is about making sure the next person is treated with greater fairness than the last. Her words settled over the group more heavily than any formal reprimand could have. Even Ryan lowered his eyes, understanding that the greatest lesson of the evening had not come from federal authority or military rank. It had come from the character of the woman who had chosen dignity over humiliation. As investigators prepared to begin a formal review, the desert highway slowly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Cars continued passing beneath the stars, unaware that on one quiet stretch of Arizona pavement, assumptions had finally collided with truth, and truth had refused to move.